Hey, what's up guys, this is Tristan, and recently I finished Dragon Ball in its entirety, so today I'm going to be reviewing all 42 volumes. So Dragon Ball starts off with this girl named Bulma who stumbles upon this mysterious boy named Goku. Now, Goku, he's not your typical boy. You know, he has a tail, he has super strength, and something overall just isn't right about him. But nonetheless, they go off on their adventure to find the Dragon Balls. Now, if you don't already know, Dragon Balls are these 7 magical orbs, and when gathered together, you can summon a dragon named Shenlong, who can grant you 1 wish. And as you would expect from orbs of this power, they attract some pretty evil people, some pretty greedy people, and overall just a bunch of trouble that Goku and Bulma have to deal with. But also along the way, they meet some of their closest friends, such as Master Roshi, Krillin, Oolong, and a variety of other great characters. Now, that's pretty much the main story for the first 16 volumes, and I'll talk about the story for the rest of the series a little bit later because in Z, things get pretty wild. Now, it's also important to remember that in Japan, the series wasn't published as 2 different series, it was just published as one 42-volume long manga, and then at volume 17 is where the anime shifted to Z, and then in the US they also shifted that to Z because that was what it was known for. So yeah, that's important to remember. Now, if you don't already know, volumes 1 through 16 are heavily focused on comedy, and Akira Toriyama does the comedy incredibly well because I was laughing my ass off almost every volume of 1 through 16, and even some of the later volumes in Z, but I'll talk about that a little later. Now, as for my overall opinion about shonen manga comedy, I usually don't find it super funny just because it's either not that funny to outsiders of Japan because of cultural differences, or a lot of the times it's just lost in translation if it's a play on words. But in Dragon Ball, the comedy isn't exclusively funny to Japan because it's not solely based on cultural differences, and a lot of it is actually slapstick humor. And in addition to this, the lovable characters really help make it a blast to read every volume. I also want to give some big props to the Red Ribbon Army Saga because that was probably the pinnacle of comedy in Dragon Ball. Now, at this point, I should probably start talking a little bit about Z because it's kind of hard to talk further about Dragon Ball without talking about Z because it makes up about 60% of the series, and like I said, it's what most people know the series for, so it's kind of hard to talk about it without mentioning it. One thing about Z, though, is this series doesn't have much comedy whatsoever. It still has comedy. I know a lot of people say that Z doesn't have any comedy whatsoever. It still has it sprinkled throughout the series, but besides the Majin Buu arc, the series really doesn't have too much comedy until then. And this is kind of disappointing because my favorite parts in the early volumes of Dragon Ball were definitely the comedy. And at this point in the series, Volume 17, or Dragon Ball Volume 1, whatever you want to call it, that's pretty much where the series officially shifts from a comedy martial arts series to a big superpower dramatic action series. And that's definitely not a bad thing because I love Dragon Ball from start to finish, but it's definitely a pretty abrupt shift. And even though I was disappointed to see the lack of comedy in Z, I still really love the introductions of some of my favorite characters in the entire manga, such as Vegeta, the development of Piccolo, Trunks, and most notably Gohan, who's probably my favorite character in the entire series, and this really paved way for some great thought-provoking and emotional moments for Dragon Ball Z. And I know that a lot of people like to say that Dragon Ball doesn't have any emotional moments because the Dragon Balls can pretty much bring back any dead character, and even though that's kind of true to some extent, I do think that that's definitely not true overall, because the emotional moments in Dragon Ball have a lot more to do with character progression than character deaths. And even though I think that the character deaths could have been handled better, I do think that it almost makes it more meaningful that the series doesn't rely on deaths as a gimmick, because these characters work their asses off day and night to surpass who they are, and when they finally achieve their goal or use their powers for the good of humanity, it really hits some big hitter feel moments.
And so your son may be the most powerful person in the world, but he's also a scared 11-year-old boy!
Come here, son.
Dad, what's wrong?
Now this pretty much brings me to my negative points about the series, because even though I don't have a ton of problems with Dragon Ball, I do think that there are some major assholes that are pretty hard to ignore. And a lot of these scenes have to do with what I mentioned with the Dragon Balls, where when a character dies, they can pretty much be like, oh well, that's fine, we'll just bring them back. or when there's restrictions placed on the Dragon Balls, they're just like, oh, well, that's fine, we'll just find some way around that to bring back the Dragon Balls, or, you know, get rid of those restrictions. And pretty much every time Goku can't beat a really strong villain, he ends up unlocking a new power-up and beating them. Now, even though there definitely were a lot of major assholes in the series, I don't think that a lot of them really affected my enjoyment, but they did get pretty repetitive, and it did get pretty tiring to see the same cop-outs every time something like that happened. Also, Dragon Ball has a lot of cliches, but it's kind of hard to knock the series for that because Dragon Ball pretty much invented most of those cliches. Now, I want to talk about some of the arcs a little bit. I'm not going to mention every single one, but I'm definitely going to mention a few of the major ones because first off, with the Frieza stuff, it's pretty decent. I mean, it's definitely too long. I think that the final fight is way too dragged out, but overall, it's pretty great, and that's some classic Dragon Ball Z right there. And after that is the Android/Cell stuff, and this is by far my favorite arc in the series. It has the best Gohan moment in the series. It has some amazing stuff with Trunks. That's where he was introduced, and overall, that's just an amazing arc, and it's probably the pinnacle of Dragon Ball right there. The main thing I want to talk about, though, is the Majin Buu arc, because Akira Toriyama originally wanted to end the series after the Cell Game saga, but due to some editorial stuff, he had to keep going and make one more arc. And needless to say, I mean, there's a lot of mixed opinions about this arc. Now, I can see why people didn't like this arc, because it definitely brings back a major comedy focus, and it's a lot more goofy and ridiculous than a lot of the other Z stuff was. And the comedy did sort of feel out of place, because at that point in the series, Dragon Ball Z was already so focused on the serious stuff and so grounded in that it was kind of hard to go back to the comedy stuff like how it was in the early volumes while it was still on such a big scale, so it did kind of feel weird there. But I do think that there were some good laughs in this arc, and I do really like the dynamic between Majin Buu and Hercule. With that being said, though, if it weren't for the Majin Buu arc, Vegeta would have never learned to be selfless, and he would have never learned to care for Bulma and Trunks like how he did at the end of the series. And I'm not going to go in depth into that because I know a lot of people probably don't know what I'm talking about who haven't read the series. But nonetheless, that's definitely top 5 Dragon Ball moments for me. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the Great Saiyaman arc, because I know a lot of people have mixed opinions about this one, but overall, I mean, I really like this arc because it shows Gohan just living his daily life and balancing his school life to being a hero and using his powers for the good of humanity. And before this point in the series, Gohan always had to use his powers because he was forced to, and in the Great Saiyaman arc, he was finally able to do what he wanted to do with his life. For my final verdict on the series, I mean, I'm not really sure what more to say, except I know a lot of people like the series because of the nostalgia or how influential it is, and it's definitely great because of those reasons, and I never really grew up with it a ton, but I still love Dragon Ball. I mean, this is my first time reading it from start to finish, and it's definitely one of my favorites. I mean, if you haven't read the series, and if you're kind of iffy about it, I would highly recommend checking it out because it's pretty great. With all that being said, guys, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to slap a like button on it, subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know what you think of this video or this series, and I will see you guys in the next video.